the next problem was, what are we going to write this software in? Because the Mac had traditionally been written in 68K assembly, which is a very low-level language that lets you do things very small and very fast, but it takes a very long time to do anything. So all the low-level routines of the Mac, like quick draw, all that stuff, all done in assembly. So we said, no, not assembly. How about C? C was the upcoming thing in Apple. Everything was starting to be written in C, all the new software. Higher level language, but still not very high level. Some people call C portable assembly. So C++ was the next obvious contender. Now, in 1989, C++ had just been invented. In fact, I don't even know if it was just recently called C++ at that point. It had been called C with classes before that. So saying you were going to use C++ was a little bit crazy because it wasn't stable. It was changing constantly. The only compiler for it was from AT&T, and you had to sign this 57-page license agreement to get it, and it was very weird. But it was, it was a contender. Then we started looking elsewhere. There was a thing called Trellis Owl, which came from Digital Equipment, and that looked pretty cool. No one's ever heard of that now, of course. Smalltalk, of course. Whenever you're thinking of doing advanced programming, at least in those days, you would think of doing it in Smalltalk, which is a much higher level object-oriented interpreted language. I guess it doesn't have to be interpreted. It can be JIT compiled. Objective-C is what Next Step was written in, and of course what macOS, which but we won't get into that, it uses today. And that was actually available, although it also had to be licensed, and we weren't sure we could get the runtime and so on. We hired Bruce Horn, who co-wrote the Finder with Steve Capps, and as I said, he was my office mate, so he was obviously in grad school at the time. So he needed the money, so we got him to come and consult and write us a big report on languages. And one of the things he was very interested in was this thing called a constraint-based language, which is so esoteric I won't even bother to explain it. There's also a language called Beta, which is from the originator of object-oriented programming in Scandinavia. No one's ever heard of that. Scheme, which is a very boiled-down form of Lisp, very popular in computer science circles. Oak Lisp, which is the first object-oriented Lisp done at CMU. No one's ever heard of that. And Self, which had an influence later on, but was quite interesting because it was a very minimal language, but it could actually be compiled in a way that seemed to make sense to us, unlike some of these other ones. And Common Lisp, which is basically, it's like the opposite of Scheme. It's also Lisp, but it's the biggest Lisp. It's the most productive, fullest form of Lisp. And we basically decided none of these were going to work, and what we needed was a language called NewTalk. So just like the hardware, we decided, no, current stuff isn't good enough for us. We're going to have to build a new thing. Now, so we produced a lot of requirements on how fabulous this language had to be, and realized that none of us were actually language implementers and didn't really want to be language implementers. So we went on a search to find out who is going to do this language for us. Yes?
You didn't discard Pascal too in that process?
Oh, no, Pascal was out.
Okay.
And if you're going to use Pascal, you might as well use C at that point.
Eiffel was the other.
Oh, Eiffel, yeah, we did look at Eiffel. That's a good point. Another licensing issue, because he was very proprietary with that thing. So, of course, we ended up, as you may know, going all the way to the other end of the country and discovering a company called Coral Software.
Oh, yeah, I should work with them.
And, oops, I'm sorry about the really loud noise that's on the tape now. But I have a piece of memorabilia for you. Let's see. So you have to tell the history of any Apple project in T-shirts. So Coral Software, I wish I had a picture of Coral Software because it was, at that time, if you imagine that you're going to fly to Cambridge and you're going to go to a company that was started by a bunch of ex-Lisp hackers from MIT, it was just like what you're imagining. So it was this house, and it had wires everywhere and like empty Coke cans, all over the place, and some really incredibly brilliant people stuck in this house with a lot of computers. And they produced this thing called it was called Coral Common Lisp back then, CCL. It was the best Common Lisp anywhere, as far as I could tell, and it ran on the Mac for some reason. I guess because the Mac had the best UI hardware at the time, and it had 68,000, which is very easy to write Lisp for. So they had this, they were famous for having this great Lisp. In fact, I had used it in grad school before I showed up at CMU. So I was excited to go visit them. And we ended up acquiring them, which is why I have this T-shirt. And they became the Cambridge lab of the Advanced Technology Group. So they always refer to this T-shirt as Coral software being submerged under the sea of Apple. But I think it was just supposed to be, coral growing under the sea. But and it's a coral-colored shirt, which is very poetic as well.
Does the T-shirt fit you, or?
Oh no, none of my old T-shirts fit me. Please. Did you see that picture? Oh, I forgot to show this, by the way. This is my first Apple. No, it's my second Apple shirt, I think. This is the Special Projects sweatshirt with the pencil, with the this
The newt.
and the newt, the pencil newt combo. It's very strange.
The Special Projects Group later became called the Advanced Products Group. Right?
Yes, when Larry Tesler moved from Advanced Technology to take over, he turned into Advanced Products. Okay, so they became the Cambridge lab, and they took Scheme, Common Lisp, CLOS, and made this thing called Ralph. And if you're curious about Ralph, we have a lot of documentation that we can look at to see what the story was there. But basically, it was what we did for the hardware, they were going to do for Lisp. So basically, every great idea anybody had boiled down and hopefully made coherent, and they were going to make a fabulous new language called Ralph. Now, while they were working with us on this, we asked them, well, okay, so this language is going to be great. Can you please tell us some estimate of how long it will take to make it and how fast it will run and all that sort of stuff you'd want to know? So they took this Hobbit processor, which you'll recall had been designed to run nothing but Unix, which is written entirely in C, and tried to figure out how to run Lisp on it. And they basically came back with the answer, no, you actually can't make a Lisp that runs on that processor unless you're willing to just basically pay a 10 or 20 times speed deficit. And we kept saying, no, that can't be the right answer because this is the only processor we can use. It's the only low power processor we can get. So the answer has to be yes, you can implement on that processor. But they kept saying, no, actually, we tried again, and you can't do it. And at the same time this was happening, AT&T was, there were some kind of business issues with AT&T as well. There was a lot of money involved and so on. And so the business folks were saying, I don't think this deal with AT&T is going to be quite as good as we thought it was. So all the pressure was there to basically change processors out from under us. So we said, well, maybe the MIPS processor. There's this AM29000 that was big back then, maybe that. We looked at a bunch of things. Finally, they said, no, there's this thing called the ARM that you've never heard of. And actually, that's not true. You had heard of it. If you look back at that first slide about Newton hardware, there is an ARM in there. It's the little embedded processor running the RF LAN controller. So I think it was an ARM 2. So there always was an ARM in Newton. It just was a coprocessor at the time. So the ARM is a very nice little architecture. It's really actually great for implementing Lisp on. And they said, this thing looks really good to us.
Is it called ARM yet, Walter?
Yeah. It was Acorn RISC Machine was the original name. Advanced RISC Machine is the official name. So the ARM was this little processor created by Acorn Computers, which is in the UK. They made the BBC microcomputer, which was very big back in the 80s. And it was 6502 based, and they wanted to do the second generation. And there was no 6502 compatible chip that would suit them. It wasn't fast enough. So back in those days, and Acorn is always a sort of funny company, which is why they were sort of fun to work with. But their natural conclusion was, we should design our own processor. So they went off and did that. That didn't seem crazy to them for some reason. So they made this thing called the ARM, which is now, it's now in, I think I just read yesterday, they make 75% of embedded processors. Or they don't make them, they design them. They don't make anything. They license it to practically every chip manufacturer, and the chip manufacturers embed them in chips all over the place. So practically everything has an ARM in it nowadays. But it was interesting to us at the time because it really had a very good processor power situation. The MIPS per watt were very, very good. And of course, that was going to be important for battery life and so on.